Well, it's April 23rd. We're probably all getting a little stir crazy, but I hope you're staying safe. We're going to do now more comparative statics with the international finance diagrams, and I'm intentionally going back and forth between long run and short run so that you can contrast them. Now let me first review very briefly what we did in the last lecture. So first of all, when we looked at this orange, which is scribbled out here, but we looked at a shift outward in net export demand as a function of the real exchange rate. And of course, net export demand is also the demand for dollars. What we found there is it didn't change the amount of net exports, and because it didn't change any of these curves up here, it didn't change the amount of investment. There's no reason it would have changed the amount of government purchases, and it also didn't change the natural level of output. So the amount left over for consumption would be the same. Now, if we go to the short run, with that increase in demand for net exports at a given level of the exchange rate, which of course with the exchange rate going up becomes no change in the quantity of net exports. If we look at that in the short run, then with just the interest rate fixed, and this is not particularly helpful for the orange case, but the interest rate doesn't change. And in the short run, you find there's no change in aggregate demand. Why no change in aggregate demand? There's no change in investment demand, no change in net exports, no reason for any change in government purchases. And then the consumption, the only thing that would move that would be a change in GDP itself, but there's no reason for GDP to change if the investment and government purchases and net exports stay the same. And we're certainly, and this isn't a change in the desire for consumption overall. This is maybe some change in the in the balance between getting goods at home and abroad because of tariffs, but not a change in overall consumption. So that's the orange shift here. Now ignore the orange, and we talked about the purple. We had a reduction in the interest rate because of an increase in saving. Well, in the saving curve, and so we had an increase in the quantity of capital flow, an increase in the quantity of investment. The increase in the quantity of capital flow provides more dollars, more loans for the rest of the world so they can buy US goods. So the quantity of net exports went up, equal to the amount by which the capital flow went up, and the real exchange rate went down. Very similar things actually when you're in the short run and the central bank cuts the real interest rate. That again makes the capital flow go up, quantity of capital flow go up, quantity of investment go up. The dollar depreciates, the price of the dollar goes down, this real exchange rate here, that supplies more dollars that allow people to purchase more American goods on net. All right, so that's what we looked at last time, and I guess the other thing I should say is in the while in the long run story where the beginning was the shift out in the saving curve, the consumption went down just as much as these other three components of investment, net exports, and government purchases went up, and we know that has to be the same amount because in the long run, aggregate demand ends up equal to the natural level of output. Differently, in the short run, we saw that, well, investment demand went up, the net export demand went up, and And government purchases probably even went up just because with the interest rate expense going down, the deficit, government deficit looks better, so the government probably feels it can go out and purchase more goods. But I put a question mark there. All of those things raise aggregate demand. That raises output and has some second and third round effects on consumption. So we have an increase in aggregate demand. Now, one of the really important things about this is something I emphasized in an earlier lecture, the fact that the central bank, by choosing the real interest rate, and remember they do that by choosing the nominal interest rate, and then inflation is, it doesn't change super fast, especially the inflation that in the sticky prices. You know, food and energy prices move around, but the inflation in the sticky prices stays pretty similar, and so think of that as fairly anchored in the short run. By choosing the nominal interest rate, the central bank chooses the real interest rate, and thereby it chooses any level of aggregate demand that it sees as appropriate. So as we do the next experiments, whenever we're talking about the short run, we'll not only talk about what the effect on aggregate demand would be of the shock all by itself, but also how the central bank would then want to adjust the interest rate in order to get aggregate demand back to the appropriate level. All right. Now, you know, and so this might be for trying to get aggregate demand to the right level. The other reason the central bank might do this would be because the natural level of output went up, maybe an improvement in technology. So there are a variety of different stories for why the central bank might want to reduce the interest rate. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is to go to some other shocks, and actually let me go back again. In the long run, there are only 4 curves that can start the ball rolling. What are they? Well, first of all, the demand for dollars and the net exports as a function of the real exchange rate, same thing, that can shift. We can have the saving curve shift, the supply of loanable funds, or we can have capital flow as a function of the interest rate, or investment as a function of the interest rate shift. So these are the 2 that we haven't done yet. That's where we're going to head. Now in the short run, we have in the short run, we still can have the net exports curve, also known as the demand for dollars curve shift. We can have the real interest rate shift. You know, the saving changing does not determine the real interest rate in the short run. The central bank choice determines the real interest rate in the short run. So we have that instead of that shift of the savings curve. And then again, even in the short run, we can have a shift in the capital flow as a function of the real interest rate, or investment as a function of the real interest rate. So that's where we're going. The remaining comparative statics questions are to have these 2 curves shift. And I'm going to draw some new curves for this. Now, I should say every comparative static movement that I do, you should for yourself do the opposite. Go through the logic, shift the curves, try to figure out what happens. You know, go through the logic in the same kind of way that we're doing here, just with the opposite direction. And then when you get to the end of that exercise and look at your graphs, you can check your work, because if you have an opposite shock, you should get exactly the opposite results. Now, of course, if you go directly to that, you're not going to learn how to shift the curves in the first place. So I'd recommend going through the logic the way I'm going through it, just in the opposite direction. And then afterwards, come back and check your work to see that in fact each different variable does exactly the opposite of what it would do if you had the opposite shock. So all of our shocks are of that sort. It's quite rare in economics to have shocks that don't, that if you have an opposite shock, you don't get the opposite action. And we're definitely in the case where opposite shocks give us opposite action. Okay, so let me draw the graphs again. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do both the shift in the capital flow curve and the investment curve in the long run, and then I'll do them both in the short run. I think that'll work pretty well. Okay, so I'm going to draw the long run graph again first. I don't want to go with what I had before because that would be too messy to have too many things going on at once. There's my supply of loanable funds, which I can also think of as the saving curve, real interest rate on that axis. On this axis, I didn't leave myself a lot of room to label it, but on this axis, I have investment plus capital flow. And I've got the demand for loanable funds. I come over here and draw capital flow as a function of the interest rate, also called just the capital flow curve. There we go, quantity of capital flow. And the actual quantity of capital flow I have given the way the graph is here. I don't know if I need these arrows on here, but I'll put some arrows there. Then let's go over to do the investment curve. There's investment as a function of the interest rate. Lower interest rate makes more investment projects look like a good deal. So you do more investment. Again, the conception behind that graph totally depends on heterogeneous investment projects. There are very, very different kinds of things you could invest in. Okay, and then I come down here for the supply and demand of dollars. The supply of dollars is simply that quantity of capital flow determined up here. And the demand for dollars is simply, actually this isn't much of a function of the real exchange rate, so I'll cross that out, but this one is, and it's net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. So I've got the quantity of net exports on this axis. Again, I'll put arrows on all of these, not that that's really necessary. Now, all of these have real interest rate on the axis, but here we have the real exchange rate on the axis. So that's why you might think, wait, why is the quantity of capital flow a constant here as we move up and down? It's because we've got the real exchange rate on the axis. When we had the real interest rate on the axis, capital flow did depend on the real interest rate. Down here, capital flow does not depend on the real exchange rate. Okay, so now let's go to a green shock. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to I want to shift the capital flow curve. Capital flow is a function of the real interest rate. So let's talk for a minute about what could possibly do that. There are actually quite a few things that could do that. One of the, wow, now I'm realizing something I left out earlier, but back when I was shifting the savings curve, I forgot to say why that savings curve might, I should go back and talk about why these other ones might shift, because I haven't emphasized enough the possible real world things that would do this. For this shock, where net exports as a function of the real exchange rate went up, I think I did mention that could be either because folks in the rest of the world decide they like American products better, maybe Americans decide they like American products better, could be because I actually do have it written down, the foreign goods start looking worse, or we have tariffs, so there are a variety of reasons there. I did neglect to say why the saving curve might shift, and there are a variety of reasons why that might be. People might be more scared about the future and want to save more. But there's a policy reason that's very interesting, which I will, I'll put links to the relevant readings for you on the course website. But once you have the structure of retirement savings accounts, there's a lot of evidence now that what you have as the default in those retirement savings accounts matters a lot. So if you said, look, instead, some people don't have retirement savings accounts. So one thing that would make a difference is if the government mandated that firms had to give people retirement savings accounts, even if it said the company doesn't need to contribute anything, but you have to have retirement savings accounts for your workers. And then importantly, let's say instead of the measly 3% that people sometimes put in, they said, look, they should be set up. The regulation said they should be set up to put in 88% of someone's wage or salary every month, and automatically deducted from their paycheck. And if somebody thought that was too much, they could go through some paperwork and say, okay, no, I don't want that to happen. But if they did nothing, then 8% of their salary would get saved towards retirement, or maybe 12% or 15%. 15% is the level that both the universities I've been at, both Michigan and here, has had. So so by default, I just mean what happens if somebody doesn't go through any paperwork. If you do nothing, what happens? Turns out people will go with that. And there are a variety of reasons that might be true. You might think it's just that people are lazy and this seems like a hard thing to do to figure out that paperwork and do it. But I think also people take the default, what happens when they do nothing, implicitly as a recommendation. And it may or may not be intended that way, but I think people respond to it that way. In any case, we have a ton of evidence that this really matters. So a good way, if as a matter of policy you wanted to increase the amount of saving, what you would do would be to simply mandate that everybody gets a retirement account, and that what happens automatically if someone doesn't go through any paperwork is to have a fairly substantial amount deducted from each paycheck. Now notice what happens with this purple shock. If you simply by this retirement saving account policy of mandating that people get automatically enrolled, and automatically there's a pretty high contribution that they can get out of, but that's what happens automatically, you notice we get more net exports. So here, the President of the United States has tried to increase net exports by raising tariffs, but that doesn't work because the exchange rate just goes up and cancels out that effect on the quantity of net exports. Instead, a policy that really would work would be to mandate automatic enrollment for retirement savings accounts. Why? Because that actually gives the rest of the world the loans they need to be able to buy more of U.S. exports, and for that matter, it makes it harder for Americans to get the funds they need to buy exports from abroad. So that's in both of those do in fact increase the quantity of net exports. Okay, so to me, retirement savings account policy is the most interesting thing, the most practical, the easiest thing to shift this savings curve. There are other things that people have tried that aren't super effective. This is one that has some real promise. Okay, now, shifting gears back to the something that will shift the capital flow, you'll realize immediately, well, let me give you three things that can shift the capital flow curve. One, let's imagine that I want to shift it outwards, and then of course you'll want to think of the reverse. Okay, what can do this? That's not a derivative, that's just a prime for a different curve. Several things that could shift out the capital flow curve. One of them is retirement savings account policy. Again, here the interesting experiment would be, leave the amount of contribution the same. Let's say you already automatically had the contribution level at 8%, but you leave that 8% the same. But before, the default was 8% contribution, and it gets put into, half into mutual funds of U.S. stocks and half into mutual funds of U.S. bonds or something like that. But then if you shifted that to saying, oh, well, now it's 1/4 U.S. stocks, 1/4 U.S. bonds, all mutual funds to keep people diversified, but then 1/4 of that 8% is in foreign stocks and 1/4 is in foreign bonds, things would be dramatically different, because now, in order for once that gets deducted from their paycheck, in order for the financial company to be able to give them mutual funds of foreign stocks, there would be these capital flows abroad. For any given interest rate, there would be a greater capital flow. So that's the first thing. So shift. Okay, so you could shift defaults in retirement saving accounts to more foreign assets. Okay, and by the way, even on just diversification grounds, it's quite reasonable to have people put some in foreign assets. So this is not just a macroeconomic policy, it's a reasonable thing to do to a certain level, to encourage people to put, to have people, when they do nothing, have funds put in foreign assets. Okay, a couple of other things. One thing that could shift out your capital flow is if, for any given safe real interest rate, people thought assets in your country looked more risky. So basically, people would want to send their funds abroad because things look extra risky in your country. This is sometimes called capital flight. So even for a given measured safe real interest rate, the expected rates of returns on other assets that are riskier might look lower, and that would tend to raise the quantity of capital flow for any given level of real interest rate. The third thing is there are there's a variety, in addition to there's sort of direct government purchases of foreign assets would also be a capital flow out of the country. So that's not something that the U.S. does a lot of, but China has done a lot of it in the past, not quite as much now. Switzerland does a lot of this. Many countries have large government purchases of foreign assets, and that shifts out the capital flow curve. By the way, I should have mentioned back when we were looking at shifts in the savings curve that government budget surpluses can do this, or reduced government budget deficits could go in this direction. So things that the government does directly can shift these curves. total amount that the government is borrowing, or total amount it's saving, can affect this curve. If the government borrows more because of a deficit, shifts the saving curve back. If the government borrows less because of a reduced deficit or even a surplus, that shifts out the savings curve. I should have mentioned that before, but that's also the case even if the total amount of government savings stays the same. If the government starts buying more foreign assets, even if it borrows domestically in order to buy foreign assets, that's going to increase the capital flow outward. So this is actually a pretty big deal for some countries, like I mentioned, Japan and Switzerland. Sorry, not Japan and Switzerland, China and Switzerland. So many reasons that could shift out the capital flow curve. However, I've given a list here of domestic things, but actually capital flows, what's a capital flow outward for the US is a capital inflow for some other country, and what's a capital outflow for another country is a capital inflow for the US. So you can take this whole list of things and think of another country doing it. Imagine another country doing something that increases its capital outflow, shifting the defaults in their retirement savings accounts, capital flight, purchasing foreign assets. This is going to cause a capital inflow. It'll actually shift this in the opposite direction. Now, obviously, if the US does the opposite direction, we'd also get that direction. But again, what's an outflow for another country is an inflow for us. So if they do something that'll do this from their point of view, it's going to shift the capital flow inward from our point of view. Okay. So trying to think if there's anything more to say about this. It's it's actually pretty interesting how all these different policies affect the capital flow. I've argued that especially when you get to direct government purchases of foreign assets, that a government ought to have to ask permission of the other government whose assets, whose country's assets they're purchasing. So as it is, there aren't a lot of rules about this, about government purchases of foreign assets. But I actually think there should be some rules because, as we'll see, it's going to affect the amount of net export. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so lots of stories here. Retirement saving account policy, capital flight, government purchases of foreign assets. Oh, I know what I was trying to remember a minute ago. Capital flight, there can be really extreme cases of capital flight where people think that, oh, this country, its assets are really risky, let's get out of this country. But there's a much more general phenomenon that whenever the world as a whole looks risky, people want to shift to the safest assets they can find. And the safest assets they can find are things like US government bonds or treasury bills or Swiss bonds. And so anytime the world as a whole looks scary, we tend to have capital inflow to the United States. So this capital flight is not just capital flight from a particular country. Sometimes you have capital flight from the whole rest of the world because the world looks extra scary and people want to send funds to the United States. And the United States economy isn't perfect, but it tends to look worse elsewhere. So there's a regular phenomenon that whenever the world gets scary, there's a capital inflow to the United States. And of course, capital inflow would be the opposite direction of shift. I've graphed an increase in capital outflow. Okay, so suppose there's an increase in capital outflow. Imagine it's because we've used this retirement saving account policy to now encourage people to diversify internationally. What's going to happen? Well, this first thing, big deal. This demand for loanable funds is the horizontal sum of the capital flow curve and the investment curve. Investment curve hasn't shifted, but the horizontal sum goes outward. So because of this, you get the demand for loanable funds going out. Now, if you forget that, you're going to get the wrong answer. And also just remember, this curve is never, ever, ever allowed to shift unless one of these two curves shifts. One or both of them shift, but I'm not going to be so hard on you as to have both of them shift but at once. Although, you know, if they did, you just add up the two effects. Okay, so what's going to happen? Well, we can see now that there's a higher equilibrium interest rate. No reason for the saving curve to shift. And we know exactly what happened to the demand for loanable funds curve. So we know the interest rate now. Okay. And so one thing we can definitely tell, and it's a little tougher because I didn't finish drawing my lines, but the quantity of investment goes down. Here was investment before, quantity of investment. Here is the quantity of investment after. So clearly investment goes down because the real interest rate went up. Now, why did the real interest rate go up? It's because there's now a greater demand for loanable funds, because you have the same demand for loanable funds for the sake of investment in the United States, but you have a greater demand for loanable funds for the sake of investment elsewhere in the world, because of course these capital flows eventually should go to something like making factories in the rest of the world. They might, or of course they might be used for foreign government purchases or consumption. Okay, so let's see what else we can tell. Now, we can see that the quantity of saving went up. That's actually worth noting. There was the quantity of saving before. Now, because the real interest rate went up, and we're assuming that saving goes up somewhat with the real interest rate, the quantity of saving goes up. But we have a bit of a quandary here, because we need to know what happens to the quantity of capital flow. Now, and remember, we don't want to just know for the particular way I drew it, but we want to know if I somehow drew things in a different but still legitimate way, something that's a real possibility, could the capital flow go the other way? And the trouble is, the quantity of capital flow, well, for a given interest rate, quantity of capital flow goes up, but the interest rate has gone up, and you can kind of sort of imagine that, okay, if it were really sensitive to the interest rate, that might more than undo that increase in the quantity of capital flow. Turns out that's not an issue for the following reason. Let's take a look. So we have this identity that the quantity of saving is equal to investment plus the quantity of investment plus the quantity of capital flow. And of course that's actually clear from this curve. But now we know some things. We know what happens, and I could use up arrows and down arrows. I think in this case I think up arrows and down arrows are fine. I could use pluses and minuses, but what's happened to investment? You should think of the answer before I tell you the answer, but it's pretty clear. Investment goes down. We don't know what's happening to capital flow yet, so let's go on to the quantity of saving. Quantity of saving went up. Okay, now think of an equation here. Equation is always this, but think of an equation like a balance beam, or a balance, like an old style kind of weight balance. So my kids' preschool had one of these where they put little bits of metal that had different weights, and they'd measure the weight of something else. So, but anyway, what have we done? Well, this side is now heavier. Okay, it's heavier. So I say up, but let's imagine that's more weight. So this side's heavier, and we got two things on this side. One of those things is now lighter. Boy, I shouldn't have used the arrows, given the up and down isn't working. But I'll tell you what. I'll switch. Okay, these are interfering with my balance beam metaphor. So be gone with them. So we've got a plus for the saving. We've got a minus for the investment. Think of the plus as getting heavier, and the minus is getting lighter. So now my metaphor is going to work. So this guy's getting heavier. Over here, I know they still balance. This side's heavier, so this side's got to be heavier. But I got two things. One of them is lighter. The only way for these to still balance is for the other thing to get heavier. Okay, so let's see what the other thing is. That's capital flow. If this side is getting heavier, and one of the two things on this side is getting lighter, the other one must be getting heavier. So there's no two ways around it. Capital flow must go up. And I do have all of this logic written down, but it's no different than what I just told you. I just have it written down in something I'll send you a link to. So far I've promised you some links about retirement savings account policy, and a link to just this explanation of why what seems like it might be ambiguous isn't really ambiguous. You only know something is truly ambiguous, that is, it can go in either direction, if you've made an example of why it would go in one direction and another example of another situation where it would go in the other direction. If you just have two different forces that are pushing in opposite directions and you don't know how they balance it out, you certainly should worry about whether it's ambiguous, but worrying about it's ambiguous is different from proving that it's ambiguous. This is one thing where you absolutely ought to worry about whether it's ambiguous, but at the end of the day, it isn't. Because of this logic, it's totally clear that the quantity of capital flow goes up. Okay, so now, with the quantity of capital flow going up, remember that quantity of capital flow gives us the new supply of dollars prime, and notice there's no reason for the net exports as a function of the real exchange rate to change. So down here, what's going on is the supply of dollars has gone up, so therefore the dollar gets cheaper. Supply and demand works. Greater supply of dollars is going to make the dollar cheaper, and the quantity of net exports will go up. So I hope that you can fill these things in when I neglect to fill them in, but in this case, I'll be very careful. New exchange rate is lower, new real exchange rate is lower, new level of net exports is higher. Okay, so we have a lot of interesting things that happened. Investment went down, quantity of capital flow went up, quantity of saving went up, interest rate went up, real exchange rate went down, that is, the dollar got cheaper, it depreciated, got weaker. Those are all synonyms, and quantity of net exports went up. So this is a retirement saving account policy that will indeed increase the amount of net exports. Now notice, just a minute ago we were talking about how increasing the total amount of saving would also raise the net exports, and that's basically because if you increase the total amount of saving, the real interest rate in the US will go down and some of the funds will end up going abroad. Here it's a little differently because you're directing funds to go abroad. So it's not operating through the real interest rate going down. In fact, the real interest rate goes up some, but of the amount of saving that happens, you're directing more of it to more of it to go abroad, even though, you know, the higher real interest rate by itself tends to pull more of the funds into the US, but your initial push to get people to invest more abroad, or maybe direct government purchases abroad, that's going to overwhelm the effect of the interest rate going up on the quantity of capital flow. Okay, so this, if you want to take a break in the middle of this video, that maybe you should have taken a break already, but if not, this is a good time to take a break. But let me go on to talk about the next shock. Okay, so, and one of the things you're going to see, one of the things you're going to see is that there's a fair bit of similarity, and we'll be able to go a little bit faster now. Okay, so I'm going to go at higher speed here. We've got supply of loanable funds, also called the savings curve. The demand for loanable funds, here's I plus investment plus capital flow, real interest rate. Okay, a lot of this, of course, is exactly the same, but I'm going faster here. Okay, so now, and then of course, let's go down to here. There's my supply of dollars curve. Well, here I'm tempted to write net exports as a function of the real exchange rate first, but I'll just make sure you got both of them there. Now, I want to talk about a shift in investment demand. Let's do that. Let's do that in red. So, shift in investment demand. And first question, of course, is why that might happen. What could possibly increase investment demand? And here are some of the answers. One is something like an investment tax credit or other tax policy favoring investment. Or other tax incentive. Now, an investment tax credit is a very, especially easy to understand tax incentive, because you buy a machine and the government in your taxes rebates 10% of the price of the machine, let's say. So that's easy to understand. There's some much more complex tax things that can affect investment as well. A second thing is just the overall business climate. Are things humming in your country? Does it look like there's high, does it look like there's a high return to capital? So I'll just call that investment opportunities. One very important example is when you have an improvement in technology that often opens up new investment opportunities and can shift the investment demand like this. All right, so there's so let's, and then of course maybe a third reason might be, I can call it animal spirits, but it's a little bit like perceived investment opportunities. There's the reality and there's what people think, and if they think there are lots of great investment opportunities, they'll invest more, even if those aren't actually such great investments. So whether the investment curve shifts out or not does not depend on whether these are in fact good investment opportunities, but on whether people think they are. So I could have just said perceived investment opportunities, but I've broken it out into genuine investment opportunities and, extra investment opportunities or extra illusions of great investment opportunities. Okay, so now let's see what happens. First thing we've got to do is to shift out the demand for loanable funds, because that's the horizontal sum of these two curves. And if you forget to do that, you're not going to get the right answer. Again, this demand for loanable funds is not allowed to move unless one of these two curves moves, or one or both. And of course, in this case, the investment curve shifted out. Okay, interest rate went up. Interest rate went up here. The position of the capital flow curve is the same, so the quantity of capital flow goes down, so my new supply of dollars is lower. Fewer funds to be loans for folks buying US goods, so net exports goes down. The original quantity of net exports, new quantity of net exports, and I've got my new higher level of the real exchange rate. I'll draw in the original level here. So the dollar goes up if there are extra investment opportunities in the United States, or perceptions of investment opportunities, or tax changes favoring investment. Then not only does the real interest rate go up, but the dollar goes up as well. Now let's finally come over to what happens to the quantity of investment itself. And here we have a similar issue that we had before. So, the way I've drawn it, it looks like the quantity of investment goes up. But did I draw it correctly, or could it be drawn a different way? We actually have a very similar question to the one we had before, and we'll go back to the very same equation here. Quantity of saving equals quantity of investment plus quantity of capital flow. Let's see what happens to these. Well, we can see that the quantity of saving goes up. We can see that the quantity of capital flow goes down, or is reduced. And again, let me do my weights here. So saving, heavier. Over here, capital flow is lighter, so something else has to be heavier to balance them out. And what's left to get heavier is, it must be this investment. I'll even put a double plus there, because given that minus, it's got to be a bigger plus than for the saving. So indeed, the quantity of investment goes up. And of course, I guess I can draw it more carefully, but hopefully you were able to see that the quantity of saving went up here. Okay, and this is where I would pause and ask for questions, and definitely do send me questions on email, on the discussion forum, and also set up, just email me a time you want to meet for office hours. Okay. So now we've done the two cases in the long run. At least I've done the direction I wanted to do, but remember, you really need to do the opposite direction. Tell the stories for why it might happen, shift the curves, go through the logic, and then when you're all done, check if you have exactly the opposite movements. All right, so now let's go to the short run. And I'm gonna have to redraw my curves again, because it's just too busy if I leave those up. Oh, what color should I do this time? I'm gonna go back to orange and purple, but I'll have the starting point in blue. Okay, so first of all, we've got the central bank choosing a real interest rate. Remember, it actually chooses a nominal interest rate, but inflation doesn't go anywhere all that fast, at least if you're talking about inflation in the sticky prices, what the Fed calls core inflation. And then we've got this interest rate here. That's okay, the central bank. Central bank chooses the real interest rate. Okay, then we come over here to get capital flow as a function of the real interest rate. And then investment as a function of the real interest rate. I don't really usually put the arrows on the graphs, but here I'll label this as I plus CF. Oh, you know what, that's actually not particularly helpful. I could label this I plus CF, but honestly, all we're using from is the interest rate determined by the central bank, and there's a sense in which this graph is almost a bit of overkill by itself, and it would be really overkill if I bothered to do the, you know, supply and demand for the monetary base, right? But that's in fact how the interest rate is determined. Basically, this interest rate is just coming from the interest on reserves, the way things are done now. Okay, so I bring over this interest rate, I get a quantity of capital flow. That quantity of capital flow gives me the supply of dollars that interacts with the demand for dollars, which is the same thing as net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. There's my real exchange rate. And also, I get a quantity of investment. All right. Now we're ready for the shock. Okay, so let's do what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the shock to the investment demand first in orange, and then the shock to capital flow in purple. So I think, like before, I'll do the orange and then ask you to ignore the orange. And the beauty of this experiment here is how simple it is. Notice, central bank has determined an interest rate. We're imagining the central bank doesn't change the interest rate to begin with, and at least to see what happens. And we definitely see that at that interest rate, now there's a higher quantity of investment. Okay, there's the orange I prime. But notice, nothing else happens because the quantity of capital flow is determined by that real interest rate and the position of the capital flow curve. And given the quantity of capital flow, the supply of dollars is the same, and there was no reason for the demand for dollars to change. And so in the case of the shock to investment demand with the central bank, like the Fed or some other central bank keeping the real interest rate fixed, you get the higher investment demand gives you more investment, but not a whole lot else changes. Now, of course, if the central bank doesn't do anything, this now is an increase in aggregate demand, because aggregate demand was equal to consumption plus intentional investment. And of course, intentional investment is really what we're diagramming here. So I mean, it is intentional investment, but I'm not really writing that out anywhere else. And then you have government purchases and net exports. Well, net exports are staying the same. No reason for government purchases to change. The intentional investment has gone up, and so aggregate demand goes up, and then you have second and third round effects of consumption going up because output goes up. So we do have a change in aggregate demand in this case. Now, the Fed ought to say, wait a minute, the natural level of output is still the same. So in this new situation, we've got aggregate demand greater than the natural level of output. And so what will the Fed want to do? The Fed will want to raise the interest rate to bring aggregate demand back down. So, you know, at first, before the Fed changes the interest rate, this increase in investment demand raises aggregate demand, doesn't do a whole lot else. But afterwards, when the Fed says, wait a minute, that's too much aggregate demand, remember, their job is to keep aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output, their main job, they do have some other jobs, then they ought to raise the interest rate. And then all this stuff we talked about before about that happens with the higher interest rate comes into play. So, you know, you have the higher interest rate, which, well, what's it going to do? Higher interest rate will reduce the capital flow, therefore it'll raise the exchange rate, you know, reduce the quantity of net exports. You can work that through. And by the time the Fed adjusts to get aggregate demand back down, what happens? Well, first of all, if output goes back to the natural level of output, there's no reason for consumption to change because income is the same. Investment will have gotten higher and net exports will have gotten lower. So if the Fed does its job well and gets aggregate demand back down, you'll wind up in a situation where I is up and net exports is down. However, on the exam, I'm typically going to break this into two pieces. I'm typically going to ask you, if the central bank kept the interest rate the same, what would happen? And then I'll ask, well then, maybe in a different question, I'd ask, well, what should the central bank do, you know, given that that's happened, where does aggregate demand look relative to where it was before? And assuming that natural level of output is the same, what should the Fed do to get the aggregate demand back to equal to the natural level of output? So break this into the two pieces. Just, you know, this orange experiment is for a given interest rate, but that would increase aggregate demand, and so the Fed would want to raise the interest rate to undo that. But I'll try to separate those two pieces of the story: the initial effect at a given interest rate, and then what the Fed's response should be. I'll try to separate those into two different questions. Okay. Good. Again, I'd stop and ask questions, but that's the disadvantage of doing things asynchronously. I think there are a lot of advantages of doing things asynchronously, but it's not all pluses. Trade-offs are one of the, everything has trade-offs, and that's one of the basic principles of economics. Okay, so now I'm going to cross out what's in orange. Imagine that never happened. Okay, so all the orange stuff goes away. And now in purple, I'm going to look at a shift in the a shift in capital flow as a function of the real interest rate in the short run. And by the way, same list of things can do this. Okay, so we had what shifts the curves is not any different. Retirement savings policy, capital flight, government purchase of foreign assets could be that a foreign government, you could get a shift in this direction if a foreign government, say, went the other direction with these policies, or you could get the opposite shift if a foreign government did this. So, and of course, similarly, what shifted the investment curve could be the same things, you know, animal spirits, genuine investment opportunities, investment tax credit or other incentives. So what's happened kind of in a real world way to shift the curve is the same. So now focusing on this curve, again, our stories are, we've got a retirement savings account policy to have more investment in foreign assets, to do more diversification into, with some mix of domestic and foreign assets instead of just domestic assets, or again, capital flight or government purchases of foreign assets. Whatever the reason for this shift, and again, you should do the opposite direction, but whatever the reason for this shift, the analysis is easier in the short run when the interest rate is constant. Why? Because first of all, the interest rate stays the same, because that's just fixed down by the central bank by assumption. And so the quantity of investment stays the same. And we clearly have a higher quantity of capital flow. There's not even anything tricky here because the interest rate didn't change. So the shift out in the curve for the same interest rate gives us a greater supply of dollars, which lowers the real exchange rate. Here's our new real exchange rate. And increases the quantity of net exports. Okay, so it increases net exports in the short run as well. And I'm trying to think if there's anything much more to say. Oh yeah, we got to talk about aggregate demand. Well, if we look back at aggregate demand, intentional investment is the same, which I just labeled as I over there. There's kind of a invisible intentional on that. Intentional investment is the same. That is, you know, not just unintentional inventory investment, everything else. No reason for government purchases to have changed, but net exports went up. Net exports went up, so output went up. So aggregate demand went up, so output went up. And with output going up, you get more consumption. So, you know, remember, maybe I should draw it again. We had C, I, G, and X. Those are the different components of aggregate demand, which equals output. This means a positive effect. That is, if these guys go up, aggregate demand goes up. And then we've got our Keynesian multiplier. So net exports went up. That makes output go up. That makes consumption go up in second and third round effects. You know, we can keep going around this circle, though each time we go around, the effect gets a bit weaker, so it does converge. But in any case, aggregate demand went up because the capital flow curve shifted out. And so like for one exam question, that would be end of story. You can see what happens to each variable. No change in investment, quantity of capital flow goes up, interest rate stays the same. Real exchange rate goes down, that is the dollar depreciates or gets weaker, and higher quantity of net exports, you can see, which gives you more aggregate demand. But I could easily have a second question on the exam, which would be, okay, given what happened to aggregate demand, now, you know, first you might want to think, what's the situation relative to the natural level of output? Well, if aggregate demand was equal to the natural level of output before, that's kind of in blue, so aggregate demand, well, I'll put it here, aggregate demand equals the natural level of output before. Now, aggregate demand, which is going to be equal to the actual level of output, I should actually put that in, actual level of output was equal to the natural level here before. Actual level of output is now greater than the natural level of output. So the Fed is going to want to raise the interest rate. And of course, if they raise the interest rate to bring aggregate demand back down, a bunch of things happen. The interest rate goes up, capital flow goes down, investment goes down. The capital flow, well, I say capital flow doesn't go down, but in fact, capital flow won't go up as much. And what's going to happen in the end is the net exports will still go up, but not as much, and the investment will go down. And so after the Fed has done its bit. But again, the way I want you to think of these questions is what happens when the real interest rate stays the same? Then what would the Fed want to do to get aggregate demand back to the natural level? And what would happen then? There's the effect of the interest rate itself. There's kind of the effect of all the things put together. And the rule of thumb here is whatever started things going will still go in that direction, but maybe not as much once the Fed tries to get aggregate demand back down. So something else will adjust so that that's still, in this case, capital flow quantity still goes up, and capital flow quantity is equal to net exports quantity. This will still go up, though less so given the interest rate increase. And the thing that allows that to happen and have aggregate demand stay the same is for the investment to go down. And you might say, wow, what happens to consumption? Well, if output is going to go back to the natural level, then that output is income as well. And so there's no reason for consumption to change, really. I mean, I suppose you could worry about the interest rate effect on consumption. And in that case, you could say, well, net exports goes up and investment goes down, and maybe consumption goes down some too. Now, Mankiw tends to not focus in on the interest rate effect on consumption, but there's a little bit of that. But mostly consumption will stay about the same. And I'll try to keep the exam questions about that reasonable. So I think we've done it. There's lots of comparative statics experiments here, and this is tough stuff. You might need to look back at this. However, I'm planning next to do some videos about based on the practice exam. So because of the weird way we did the second midterm, last year's second midterm and last year's final are both practice exams for this final. So what you'll want to do is to take those practice exams, which I'll put the links up for and everything. Take those practice exams, do it in a time, as I've said before, do it in a timed way, do it under time constraint, and then take all the time you want, close book, then go open book. And then finally, when you've done with that whole process, then look at the answers, and then look at the video description of the answers as well. So anyway, thanks for listening, and be safe.